Hey, what's up everyone? My name is Nigel Bajos, and in a previous video of mine, I showed you all how to set up a Panasonic GH3 or really any Panasonic camera to shoot the way I shoot. And so now I thought I would go into the grading process of how I grade my Panasonic GH3 footage. But again, this will apply to anyone with a Panasonic camera that is shooting in the natural picture profile and in the same lighting conditions that I am. So I have done other color grading tutorials in the past. I did one that you can check out that was just using levels inside of Premiere Pro. And that's what I used to use to just, add a certain look to films with my Canon T2i, doing wedding films and stuff like that. And then I did another one where I showed you how you can grade and create your own LUTs within DaVinci Resolve. But this grading tutorial is going to be all within Premiere Pro, and we're going to be using Lumetri colors. So let's get into Premiere Pro, and I'll show you what I do to make my GH3 footage look as good as it possibly can be. All right, so here we are in Adobe Premiere Pro, and I just grabbed a few clips that I thought would be fun to grade. First thing I'm going to do is just, grab my clip. With this clip, it was filmed on my Panasonic GH3 with all those settings that I mentioned in my previous video about the GH3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the search bar. This is how I usually get to it pretty easily, is I just type in Lumetri color, and then we're just going to drag and drop Lumetri color right onto the clip. Then we're going to go to effects controls and then scroll down, and here we have Lumetri color. And the first thing I do is I open the basic correction tab and I start working on my color balance and my exposure. So right now this doesn't actually look too bad. I might want to swing it a little more towards green. So what I'm going to do is just swing it a little bit more towards green. Not a lot, just enough to get rid of the magenta. And then I might put the temperature up just a little bit. And so next thing I'm going to do is just focus on my exposure. As I said before, it is very important to make sure that your color balance is dialed in before you actually hit record. So you have to do as little correction in post as possible. So I kind of just like to mess around a little bit when it comes to my exposure. I expose pretty well for this scene, so I probably don't have to go too high or low, but I typically do like to just drop the exposure just a little bit just so it's not too harsh. And then I'll mess with the contrast later. Highlights, everything looks pretty good for me right now. And one thing I do is I usually drop the saturation down to about 80%. It's because I don't like to have my videos very saturated. And then after I do that, that's when I'll go to the creative tab. And I'll usually start with adding a little bit of the faded film, and this is just gonna kind of bring up the shadows a little bit and give it a little bit of a muddy look. Now you can't really tell, but when you look into the shadows, you'll see that it's a little more muddy than it usually is. And I typically never go past 30. 30 is usually where I stop, because if you go super harsh on this, it's gonna look really obvious that you're just trying too hard. So don't ever go crazy with this faded film. I would say keep it at 30 and maybe at the most 40 if it's a really specific look you're going for. And then sometimes I usually don't like using sharpen inside of Lumetri color. I like to do that with unsharp mask, but every once in a while I'll add just 7 or something like that to my footage. And if we look here, my footage actually starting to look how I want it to. And with the contrast, after I've, upped the faded film a little bit, that's when I'll go back to contrast and see if I want to add any, if I want to add any contrast and crush the blacks a little bit. And if I add too much, it's going to look just way too crushed, but I like to add, I don't know, maybe 20. And sometimes what that does is it actually counters the faded film. So in those situations, that's when you could add a little bit more, but I usually just like to, bring up the blacks a little bit instead, and then, crush them a little bit with the contrast. Honestly, the next thing that I would go to is just straight onto my color wheels. And this is where you can actually start adding the kind of look that you want. One look that I'll experiment with a lot is I'll try moving the shadows to a more blue color and then the highlights to a more orange, just because those colors are opposite of each other and it usually, you know, tends to look pretty good. But again, I don't like to go too crazy with any of this. This is all just experimenting if I wanted to go for a different look. So yeah, that's typically how I would leave a shot. I always, with GH3 footage, I'm always like really hyper conscious about making sure that the colors don't go to magenta, because I just absolutely hate that. So a lot of the times I'll just add more green than I would normally to any other, you know, piece of footage. And again, I'm focusing a lot more on the landscape around me. I'm not going to be super critical about, you know, skin tones, especially when the subject is that far away. It's not that huge of a deal for me. But if you look at the before and now the after, there's obviously a more distinct faded look that I've added to my footage. You know, sometimes going back and forth with this, I can kind of see that like I've gone too far in one area than the other. I think that I may have added a little bit too much green, so I'm going to dial that back just a little bit. And I also kind of realized that I don't like so much the shadows being that blue, so I'm just going to bring them back a little bit and then maybe give a little bit more life to the midtones. And then honestly, that looks perfectly fine. That's something that I would probably be okay with. And if I had other clips that were shot in the same area at the same time, what I would do first is just copy and then paste the Lumetri color that I just did to this clip to the rest of the clips and then tweak them as needed. So this is the before, this is the after. Didn't do a whole lot to it, and sometimes you really don't need to do a bunch to the footage that you shoot. As long as you expose it right and you white balance correctly, you're just doing minor tweaks to make it look exactly the way you want it to look. All right, so let's try another clip, and this is going to be one that is probably going to need the least amount of color grading, I believe. And this is one that I shot out in Mount Hood, and it's just a clip of me going out and looking at the mountain. So I'm just going to grab that. So it's a pretty cool shot. And again, we're just going to take Lumetri color, add it to the clip, go into effects controls. And with this clip, I would honestly not do that much. In fact, I would probably go the opposite direction of where I normally go with, you know, clips like this, where I take saturation away and I muddy the blacks a little bit. With a clip like this, since it's kind of like a more epic shot, I would honestly bring the exposure to where I would actually probably leave the exposure right there, just bump it by like 3, and then I would actually take the contrast first and just bump that up to about 25. And what that's going to do is just going to like define me and define the mountain a little bit more. And then I would actually add some saturation just because of how the blue haze is acting here and how you can see the sun disappearing in the background. And then honestly, I would not do much more to this clip except for add maybe just a little bit of a fade. Not that much. I would maybe go to 15. And then I would just sharpen it a little bit. And I would only sharpen it here in Lumetri if I was just, you know, trying to pump this out really quickly. But honestly, again, I like to use unsharp mask instead of the sharpen tool here in Lumetri color. So this is the before and this is the after. Not a huge difference, but again, with clips that you expose properly and get the white balance right in camera, you'll realize that you don't actually have to add that much to your footage. And this is especially true with cameras like the GH3 or any camera that doesn't have a log shooting mode. You can still get great shots with great dynamic range. You just got to make sure that you expose properly. So let's go to another clip that might take a little bit more grading and a little bit more time to do. And this one I'd probably have to spend a little bit more time on. So let's take Lumetri color. And straight off the bat, this clip actually looks pretty good. I like the red and the green in the background, and her skin looks, you know, perfectly natural. But with this, I would actually kind of want to, you know, just pay a little bit more attention with how her skin looks and how the background looks. So I'm gonna first start with just adding a little bit of warmth to the shot, just because that'll, you know, bring a little bit of life to her skin. My sister does have pretty pale skin, but just adding a little bit of warmth into the shot's gonna help a lot. And then I'm gonna just kind of look at the tint and just see if bringing it one way or the other is gonna help at all. I think it's actually pretty good where it's at, so I'm just gonna keep that at 0. And then the exposure, you can tell ever so slightly, we almost clipped here on her face because her face is pretty white, but I'm gonna take the exposure down just a little bit. That's one thing that you should always, you know, keep in mind is when you're shooting someone's face, make sure that you expose their face properly and you don't clip, especially when you're filming, you know, people with pretty pale skin. You don't want the highlights to clip on their face because that's really hard to bring back unless you're shooting raw or something. So then again, I'm gonna save my contrast for later. I'm gonna take the highlights and see if I can save her face just a little bit by taking the highlights down. And that does help a little bit, so I'm stoked on that. And then I'm gonna add a little bit of exposure because I don't want it to look too dark when you take the highlights down. And the shadows, sometimes I mess with those, but I actually pretty much like where they are right now. In fact, I might actually take them down a little bit. And then I'm gonna leave the whites and the blacks where they are. Saturation, I'm actually gonna leave that exactly where it is because I like the color that's going on here and I don't wanna take any of that away. So I think that actually looks pretty cool. And again, with the faded film, I'm probably just gonna go up to 30 and just leave it at that. And as you can see, that definitely creates more of a mood to this shot. It looks a little bit more moody. And again, I'm just gonna go with the sharpening and just up it just a little bit. I don't wanna go too crazy because this is already a pretty sharp image. So actually, for me, I could go crazy and like, you know, try to change the colors around a lot, but I actually really like how this shot looks. I think that it's a really well lit shot. And if you go to the before, you can see that I didn't change that much, but I changed just enough to give it a little bit more character and make it look a little bit more cinematic. So that's basically the rundown of how I edit my stuff. Not super crazy what I do to it, but as you can see, a lot of the look that I'm getting actually starts with getting a properly exposed and a properly white balanced shot in camera before I hit record. So that's something that I think is really important, and I can't stress that enough. Even if you have a camera that shoots S-Log or can shoot RAW, I think that it's still very important to learn how to expose and white balance your footage before you even hit record. The only other thing that I would do to maybe a clip like this is add some film grain. That's something that can be done really easily. I have some Fuji 35mm 4K film grain here. So I'm just gonna drag that on top and cut it to the size of the clip. I'm gonna right click, and I'm gonna go to scale to fit frame size. And then I'm going to scale it up so that it fills my 1080p frame. And then I'm gonna go to the opacity tab and click it to overlay. And then we have a nice film grain, and it's very subtle, but I add that a lot because it kind of masks any digital noise and it makes it look like it's actual film grain, and it just adds a little bit more to the cinematic quality that I'm trying to get. So yeah, that was my process on how I grade my footage. And just remember that like every project isn't going to be the same, but these, you know, principles and the way that I edit my footage can be applied to pretty much any project that you're working on. And just remember, less is more when it comes to grading most of the time. Like when you overgrade something, it can look really, really amateur and just not what you're going for. So if all else fails, just try dialing back your look a little bit more as opposed to adding more layers and stuff to it. So, but yeah, that's just my 2 cents as far as the whole grading process goes. And if you guys like the looks that I create and you want to support my channel a little bit, I do sell a LUT pack on Sellfy, and I'm going to be having another LUT pack come out pretty soon as well. So if you're into that, you can go support me by buying my LUTs. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, it'd be great if you hit the like button, and be sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to see more content from me. But until next time, I'll see you all later. Bye.